In a dark, rain-soaked village in medieval Europe, a priest named Martin found himself tormented by a demon of lust. It was Holy Saturday, a day of solemn abstinence, but the demon's whispers were relentless. Martin, a man of the cloth, remembered the strictures of the church: no marital intercourse on holy days. But his wife, Anna, refused to satisfy his desires, citing the same rules. In a moment of desperation, Martin slipped out of the house and into the barn, where he sought release with a cow. The next morning, during the Easter Mass, a flock of angry birds attacked the church. Martin, tearfully confessing his sin to the congregation, was forgiven. But when Anna tried to leave, the birds descended upon her, tearing her to pieces. The villagers saw her as the cause of her husband's sin, a stark reminder of the dangerous power of denied desire. This haunting tale is just one of many that reveal the complex and often contradictory attitudes toward marital sex in medieval Europe. The Church, with its voluminous liturgical calendar, imposed a web of restrictions on when couples could have sexual intercourse. Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and a myriad of feast and fast days were off limits. Even the weeks of Advent and Lent were times of abstinence. Add to this the prohibition against sex during a woman's menstrual period, and the number of permissible days for marital intimacy was shockingly few. Fewer than half the days in a year were considered appropriate for conjugal relations. Despite these strictures, the Church's stance was not entirely absolute. Gratians Decretum, a pivotal legal text, allowed couples to observe holy days based on mutual consent. Later writers treated these rules more as guidelines than as absolute command. However, the tension between the moral imperative of abstinence and the practical reality of marital obligations often led to intense conflict. One of the most potent examples of this conflict is the story of a couple who, driven by passion, engaged in sexual intercourse inside a church. The next morning, they were found stuck together like dogs, a spectacle that both horrified and amused the congregation. This tale, while likely more symbolic than literal, highlights the pervasive belief that sexual acts, especially in sacred spaces, could bring divine retribution. The Church's views on sexual purity extended beyond the act itself. Women who had recently given birth were considered unclean and were not allowed to enter a church until 40 days after childbirth. This period, known as churching, was a ritual of purification and thanksgiving. While the Church saw this as a way to honor the new mother, many women may have viewed it differently. The ritual could be seen as a way to integrate the new mother back into the community, but it also underscored the perceived impurity of childbirth. Medieval Jewish society, while less restrictive than Christian society, had its own set of rules. The Talmud, a central text of Jewish law, prohibited a man from forcing his wife to have sex, a stark contrast to the Christian doctrine of the marriage debt. Jewish law also recognized the importance of marital sex for pleasure, not just procreation. However, there was one significant taboo. A woman was considered unclean during her menstrual period and had to immerse herself in a ritual bath, or mikveh, before resuming sexual relations with her husband. The mikveh was a public institution, and the act of immersion was a communal event. When a woman visited the mikveh, everyone knew that she and her husband would have sex that night. This was not seen as shameful but as an obligation. The mikveh, however, was also a site of conflict. Some women, for various reasons, refused to go, leading to tensions within the marriage. One story tells of a woman who refused to immerse herself until her husband purchased books for charity, using her refusal as a means to pressure him into a worthy deed. The mikveh also played a role in miraculous tales. One such story recounts how the tyrant Antiochus, by closing the ritual baths, prevented pious men from having sex with their wives. God, in response, caused pools of water to appear in their homes, allowing the couples to resume their intimate lives. The belief in the power of the mikveh extended to folk traditions. A legend about Rabbi Ishmael's mother holds that the nature of her child was determined by what she saw upon leaving the ritual bath. She encountered various undesirable sights: swine, a leper, a camel, until finally seeing the angel Gabriel, leading to the birth of a fine and handsome son. While love was one of the purposes of marriage, excessive pleasure was often seen as sinful. Canonist Gratian labeled those who married for sexual pleasure as fornicators. Some Jewish writers, like Maimonides, even suggested that circumcision reduced sexual desire, a view that was echoed by his followers. The tension between the moral and the practical was a constant theme in medieval sexual ethics. Medieval medical writers, however, recognized the importance of mutual pleasure in marital sex for conception. They believed that female pleasure, through the emission of female seed, was necessary for successful conception. This view, while still rooted in a hierarchical understanding of gender roles, acknowledged the importance of sexual satisfaction for both partners. In the end, the medieval world was a place where the sacred and the profane, the moral and the practical, often collided. The rules and restrictions on marital sex were a reflection of a society deeply concerned with the purity and sanctity of its members. Yet, beneath the surface of these strictures, human desires and the complexities of relationships persisted, shaping the lives of men and women in ways that were both profound and often tragic. In medieval times, the experiences of husbands and wives during sexual encounters were often seen quite differently. According to medical texts of the time, the husband's main goal was to release his seed, while the wife's pleasure was thought to come from receiving her husband's seed. Some writers even suggested that women did not experience their own sexual release, and instead found pleasure through the man's ejaculation. This idea was partly based on the belief that women's sexual desire was primarily about penetration and the man's ejaculation, rather than being touched or held. These medical views were echoed in other medieval writings, like the French fabliaux, which were humorous tales that often emphasized the importance of the male organ in sexual desire. One story tells of a wife who wishes her husband's body were covered in penises, and another describes a woman dreaming about a market filled with sexual organs. These stories, written by men, reflected a male-centric view of female desire, where women were seen as wanting something done to them rather than being active participants. However, these stories and medical texts might not have accurately represented all women's experiences. They were influenced by cultural norms and male perspectives, which could shape and limit how women understood their own desires. Women who felt differently might have felt abnormal or silenced, making it less likely for their voices to be heard. Religious texts also reinforced the idea of men as active and women as passive in sexual relationships. For example, a Middle English text called Dives and Pauper discussed the various types of sexual sins, but it focused on how a man might sin by meddling with his wife, not how the couple might sin together. The woman was often seen as simply submitting to her husband, which was considered a virtuous act for a wife, but it also meant she was not seen as an active participant in the sexual act. Despite this passive portrayal, women were not necessarily passive in their desires. In some cases, women were the ones choosing to abstain from sex, especially in chaste marriages, because they had less choice in whom they married, and they bore the physical burdens of pregnancy and childbirth. Women were also often depicted as having strong sexual appetites, sometimes even exhausting their husband. For instance, in a French fabliau, a wife demanded sex so frequently that her husband eventually couldn't comply and resorted to a scatological joke. Even the wife of Bath from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who is known for her strong personality, does not deny her husband's sexual access, even though she doesn't always enjoy it. Instead, she fakes her pleasure. This shows that while she might not have enjoyed sex with her first 3 husbands, she still had strong sexual desires, which she indulged with her later husbands. The idea of women as lustful was also reflected in medieval attitudes toward widows. While remarriage was legal, it was often frowned upon, especially by the church, which idealized widowhood as a time of chastity and fidelity to the deceased husband. However, widows were often portrayed as particularly lustful, having been awakened to sexual desire through marriage. Stories like the one from the Roman Satyricon by Petronius, where a widow has sex with a soldier at her husband's grave, highlight this perception of widows as sexually insatiable. When it comes to the actual sexual practices in medieval marriages, it's difficult to determine what was typical. Today, we have surveys and interviews to understand sexual behavior, but in medieval times, we rely on a mix of literary and religious texts, which can be biased or idealized. For example, we know that married couples often shared a bed, sometimes with children or servants, and that bed curtains provided some privacy. Whether couples went to bed naked is unclear, though some illustrations show couples in bed without clothes, which might reflect a convention rather than real practice. Sexual activities likely varied by social class and region. Candles were expensive, so most people probably went to bed in the dark, which could explain why many stories involve mistaken identities during sexual encounters. The male superior position was considered the norm, and any deviation was seen as unnatural. However, the emphasis on this position in texts might suggest that some couples experimented with other positions, possibly to avoid conception. These medieval texts and stories provide a glimpse into the complex and often contradictory views of sexuality and gender roles in medieval Europe, reflecting both the cultural norms and the underlying human experiences that shaped them. In the medieval world, the idea of avoiding pregnancy was not typically encouraged, especially within marriage. However, some couples, like Marjorie Kemp and her husband John, found themselves in situations where they wanted to continue their sexual relationship without having more children. Marjorie, an English mystic from the 15th century, experienced deep depression after the birth of her first child, and later convinced her husband to stop having sexual relations with her. This decision, while radical, was sanctioned by the Church as a form of chastity. John Kemp, Marjorie's husband, was initially resistant to this idea. He posed a dramatic question to Marjorie, asking if she would rather see him killed than have sex with her again. Marjorie, deeply committed to her spiritual path, chose her husband's life over resuming their sexual relationship. This led to a negotiation where John agreed to allow Marjorie to maintain her chastity, provided she continued to share his bed, pay his debts, and eat with him on Fridays. Marjorie, however, refused to give up her Friday fast, which was a significant part of her religious practice. After praying for guidance, she was told that her fasting was a form of leverage in her negotiations with John. Eventually, they reached an agreement, and John told her, "As free may your body be to God as it has been to me." For most couples, complete abstinence was not the goal. However, the Church strictly forbade sexual activities that did not lead to conception, such as oral and anal sex, or manual stimulation. These practices were rarely mentioned in medieval texts, even when they were condemned. One of the few instances where such practices were discussed involved a nun who became pregnant through what was described as a sodomitical manner, possibly referring to anal sex. Despite this, Church authorities did not often address these issues in the context of marriage, suggesting that they might have been rare or simply not well known. Marital rape, a concept we understand today, was not recognized in medieval times. The wife's body was considered the husband's property, and he had the right to sexual access. However, there are few recorded instances of husbands using violence to force sex on their wives, which suggests that such behavior, while not impossible, was not considered normal. The legal and social dominance of husbands often provided enough coercion without the need for physical violence. Medieval texts often depicted marital sex as something initiated by the husband, with the wife submitting to his need. However, there are also stories and literary references that show women participating enthusiastically in marital sex. For example, in Chaucer's Shipman's Tale, a wife agrees to have sex with her husband in exchange for money, a motif that reflects both the power dynamics within marriage and the stereotypes of women as mercenary. The connection between sex and money in marriage was a common theme in medieval literature, often used to portray women negatively. Chaucer's Wife of Bath, for instance, speaks of how she extracted money from her 5 husbands, emphasizing that a wife should not grant sexual favors too easily, as they would then be undervalued. Marjorie Kemp herself linked sex to financial negotiations, agreeing to pay her husband's debts in exchange for chastity. Despite the limited sources, it is clear that medieval people understood marital sex as something the husband did to the wife. This is reflected in the language used to describe sexual relations, where the husband meddles with the wife. Married female saints, for example, are often described as allowing their husbands to have sex with them, rather than initiating the act themselves. One persistent myth about medieval marriage is the idea of jus primi noctis, or the Lord's right to deflower his serf's bride on her wedding night. This myth, popularized in modern media, has been thoroughly debunked by historians. While lords may have abused their power, there is no evidence that this was an official or customary right. Instead, Such stories often reflect the broader tensions and power dynamics between lords and their subjects, rather than an institutionalized practice. In the end, while the church and society had strict rules about marital sex, the reality of how couples navigated their relationships was likely more complex and varied. The limited sources we have provide a glimpse into the dynamics of medieval marital life, but they also reveal the gaps in our understanding of how people truly experienced and negotiated their intimate relationships. In medieval times, women's sexual lives were viewed very differently from men's. While men's sexual activities, especially those outside of marriage, were often tolerated and sometimes even expected, women's were not. This disparity was deeply rooted in the social, cultural, and religious norms of the period. Medieval medical theories, for example, sometimes suggested that women experienced more pleasure and desire in sexual encounters than men. These theories were based on the idea that women's bodies were more receptive, and therefore more prone to arousal. However, this belief did not translate into greater understanding or acceptance of women's sexual desires. Instead, it often led to women being seen as more lustful, and consequently, more culpable for their sexual transgressions. In popular stories and folklore, women were often portrayed as more sexually aggressive and insatiable. For instance, in the fablioques, a genre of medieval French tales, women were frequently depicted as cunning and sexually assertive, often outsmarting their male counterparts. However, these portrayals were not meant to be flattering. Instead, they reinforced the idea that women's sexuality was dangerous and needed to be controlled. Church teachings also played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward women's sexuality. Some churchmen argued that men were more responsible for sexual sins because they were the active partners, while women were passive. This idea was based on the belief that men should have the strength and willpower to resist temptation, whereas women, being perceived as weaker, were more easily led astray. This reasoning was sometimes used to explain why Adam, not Eve, was considered more responsible for original sin in the biblical narrative. Despite these arguments, the reality was that women faced harsher consequences for their sexual transgressions. Married women who engaged in extramarital affairs were often labeled as adulteresses and faced severe social and legal penalties. Unmarried women who were sexually active were frequently stigmatized and shamed, often being labeled as prostitutes or immoral. The double standard was evident in many aspects of medieval life. For example, while men could often pursue multiple sexual partners without significant social repercussions, women who did so were harshly punished. This was reflected in the legal system, where laws and punishments for sexual misconduct were often more severe for women than for men. In the context of marriage, women's sexual duties were also closely regulated. The Church emphasized the importance of marital fidelity and the procreation of children, viewing sex outside of marriage as sinful. Women were expected to be chaste before marriage and faithful within it, while men were given more leeway to engage in extramarital relationships. Moreover, the role of women in society was often defined by their relationships to men. Whether as daughters, wives, or mothers, women's lives were closely tied to their male relatives. This meant that their sexual behavior was not only a matter of personal morality, but also reflected on the honor and reputation of their families. In the end, the medieval period was marked by a complex and often contradictory set of beliefs and practices regarding women's sexuality. While some theories and stories portrayed women as more sexually driven, the social and legal systems were designed to strictly control and punish women's sexual activities outside of marriage. This double standard continued to shape women's lives and experiences for centuries to come. Throughout the Middle Ages, the perception of women's sexuality was a complex and often contradictory topic. While women were often seen as lustful beings, this did not lead to a tolerance of their sexual freedom outside marriage. Instead, it fueled a desire to control their behavior, especially in the eyes of religious and legal authorities. This was true across various cultures, including Christian, Jewish, and Islamic societies. In Christian societies, the Church preached equality in matters of adultery, but in practice, a double standard was evident. Adultery by women was considered far more serious, and was punished more severely than adultery by men. This was partly because a woman's sexual behavior was seen as a reflection of her family's honor, and any transgression could bring shame upon her entire family. Men, on the other hand, were often seen as less threatening to the family's honor when they committed adultery, especially if it did not involve a married woman. The story of King David and Bathsheba in the Bible illustrates this double standard. While David's actions were severely condemned, Bathsheba's role was less criticized, possibly because she was seen as acting under the command of a powerful king. However, the story also highlights the severe consequences of adultery, as David's actions led to the death of Uriah and the loss of his first child with Bathsheba. This narrative served as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the gravity of adultery and the importance of penance. In medieval literature, women's adultery was a common theme, often used to illustrate the dangers of female sexuality. Pastoral literature, intended to guide parish priests, frequently depicted women as the primary sinners in cases of adultery. These depictions sometimes bordered on the erotic, potentially serving as a form of entertainment for the clergy and laity alike. The fear of women's adultery was not just about sexual transgression, but also about the potential disruption of social and family order. For example, the accusation of adultery against the daughters-in-law of Philip, the Fair of France, in 1314, threatened the legitimacy of the royal succession, highlighting the political implications of such acts. The fear of women's sexual independence was deeply ingrained in medieval society. This fear led to measures such as sumptuary laws, which regulated what women could wear to distinguish between respectable and loose women. In some cases, these laws were designed to prevent women from attracting attention and potentially engaging in adulterous relationships. The fable of the singed cat, where a cat is discouraged from roaming by singeing its fur, illustrates the belief that women who go out in public are doing so for sexual purposes. This fear was so strong that some cultures, like the Byzantine, considered a woman guilty of adultery simply for attending public events or sleeping away from home. Despite these strict controls, there were occasional hints that people in medieval Europe, particularly in literary texts, sometimes found women's adultery excusable. For example, in the French fabliau, The Bourgeois of Orleans, a wife's adultery is portrayed in a way that mocks the jealous husband and suggests that the wife's actions are justified. This story, while not necessarily reflective of real-life attitudes, shows that there were limits to the strict moral codes, and that some sympathy for women's extramarital affairs could exist. Ultimately, the medieval view of women's sexuality was shaped by a complex interplay of religious, legal, and social factors. While women's sexual behavior was heavily regulated, the underlying fear and distrust of female independence reveal the tensions within medieval society. These tensions persisted, influencing the way women were treated and perceived for centuries to come.